welcome to Just Add Water. Today we're talking to Steve Hall. Steve is a fellow of the Society for the Underwater Technology. He's worked in global ocean science, technology and policy for over 30 years in the fields of sustained ocean observation, autonomous systems, policy, industry liaison and outreach, and many more maritime appointments and projects. Currently, he's the head of partnerships for the Nippon Foundation, JEVCO Seabed 2030. Steve, your business cards, you must have hundreds of them.
I'm certainly running at least 3 at the moment, Michael. So it's I'm in that very pleasant position of being towards the tail end of my full-time working career. I work as a contractor these days, and my main client is indeed Seabed 2030, but I do some work for a few other people as well. But Seabed 2030 is the bulk of my time.
Well, you are very welcome today, Steve. So I put a little snapshot together just to help inform myself more than anything, because I'm reasonably new to this. I've been working for OI for about 18 months, 2 years now. But it said, Steve, it said we know more about the moon than we do about the oceans of the world. And with those oceans covering 70% of the globe, it represents the majority of where we live. And just thinking about the oceans, they have the ability to store carbon. They hold valuable minerals. There's a predictability about the oceans in terms of tidal energy. And of course, a huge amount of biodiversity as well. So who better to talk about this than the man who's had 30 years experience of this? As noted, it's Steve Hall. Steve, simple first question. Who identified the need to map the seabed in its entirety?
Well, you could argue it goes right back to Prince Albert of Monaco 120 years ago, when he established the general bathymetric chart of the oceans. And indeed, in May in Monaco, the international community just celebrated the 120th anniversary. And what Prince Albert and his colleagues and the scientists at the time had recognized, especially as the technology was advancing, even at that point in time, the huge gaps that existed in our knowledge about the ocean floor. When you think of those incredible Victorian engineers laying those early telegraph cables all the way across the North Atlantic, they didn't even know the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was there. And inevitably, there were a few breakages and very, very expensive errors made. And every time somebody did a depth sounding, which of course before the invention of sonar was literally, a piece of rope with some wax on the end to try, and some lead to try and find how deep the ocean was. So it was not a trivial task to measure ocean depth. And arguably starting with the Challenger expedition in 1870, I've probably got the dates wrong now. It's probably, I think it's 1872 or to 1876 or so. That is really the first point where humankind discovered how deep the oceans were, how diverse the oceans were, and even surprising things to them, like that there was life everywhere. People had assumed that you'd only find fish perhaps in the surface waters or only in the sunlit layers. And it came as quite a shock to those Victorian scientists to discover that you have this enormous volume, as you said, 70% of the planet's surface, the vast majority of the life forms that live on this planet are down there, all kinds of stuff going on. And yet we had barely scratched the surface. And when Seabed 2030 started in 2017, despite almost 120 years of ocean measurement, only 6% of the ocean floor had been measured to modern standards, generally the shallow water around the edge of continents. And in fairness, that is where your supertanker might run aground. It's where the rocky bits tend to be. And for obvious reasons, humans, for safety and navigation, had learned quite a lot about how deep the ocean was in those shallow coastal regions. And once you get into water that's beyond the deepest possible draft of the biggest possible ship, to some extent, it kind of didn't matter. It's great. It's too deep for us to be able to crash into. Don't worry about it. But the world has changed. We're now laying cables, pipelines all over the world. Your listeners, your viewers will be watching this over internet connections, well over 90% of which travel across the deep ocean floor on fiber optic cables.
Yeah.
The gas they'll be using to heat their house probably going through a pipeline on the seafloor, plus all those homeland security aspects, oil and gas. Huge raft of reasons why we need to know rather more than we do already know about the shape of the seabed.
Mm. So, Nippon Foundation, did they say, okay, this is what we're going to do, or did they speak to the academics and surveyors before they cracked on?
Indeed, no. Nippon are a fascinating bunch. It's a, as the name implies, Japanese-based philanthropic organization. Funds a lot of good works around the world, as well as what they do for us with Seabed 2030. They're involved in the Partnership of the Global Oceans, and perhaps most notably in trying to eradicate leprosy, and things like this. It's a very wide, very diverse organization. And Nippon are always on the lookout for sort of good works they can do at a global scale. And clearly, Mr. Sasakawa and his colleagues had looked at this gap and thought, hang on a minute, here we are. We keep seeing this text that say we know more about the surface of the moon and Mars than we do about the Earth, which, although that isn't entirely true, as in, the maps are better of the moon and Mars, but we don't actually know about, say, the mineral content or if there's any life forms down there in the case of Mars and all of these kind of things. And we do know a lot about that. On Earth. It's just that what we have is very, very fuzzy and low resolution. And perhaps a good example is when the tragedy of MH370 a few years ago, when the Malaysian airliner was lost in the Southeast Indian Ocean. And it was quickly discovered that the charts that were held of the Southeast Indian Ocean were utterly inadequate. It hadn't been one of the big theaters of operation back in the Cold War days. So the area had never been measured to anything like the same extent as an equivalent area of seabed would have been in perhaps the North Pacific or the North Atlantic, where the rival superpowers were constantly hunting around looking for good places to hide submarines and things. Well, that wasn't happening down south. And so for those reasons, you had very, very low resolution maps down there. So Nippon decided to work with the International Hydrographic Organization and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO to help provide that essential funding that was needed to create Seabed 2030 to be an accelerator, really, a facilitator for the mapping of the global seafloor. Because at that point where the project started, so what are we looking? 2017, 6% of the global ocean had been mapped. As of May 2023, we were up to 24.9%. So it's a reasonably decent rate of acceleration, from 6% to just under a quarter in this period of only about 5 or 6 years of operation. So clearly, it's going to be very, very difficult to hit 100% by 2030, which is the target. But we're going to be an awful lot closer to that than we were when we started.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting that seafloor mapping had been focused around, for want of a better word, war zones. But of course, that makes absolute sense. Why go and map a part which isn't strategically important or strategically important? Okay, so the amount of data that's now being gathered, it must be staggering. But how's it being stored and accessed? Is it a single place or is it across multiple data centers?
It's across multiple data centers. The way it works is that you have the various entities who are out there gathering seabed data. These will be dedicated survey cruises that go around, often on other projects. They might be mapping seabed for a client, they might be mapping it for oil and gas exploration or for a cable or pipeline route. And what we'll do is work with them to say, big smiley face, hello everybody, we understand you have a few terabytes of wonderful seabed data here. Please would you mind donating it to the Seabed 2030 project so that we can feed it into the general bathymetric chart of the oceans? And most of the time people say yes, which is absolutely wonderful. And the data is vast, many gigabytes of data, and that's just the stuff that's been gathered today. What we know is that there are sat in various dusty vaults around the world the equivalent of many more gigabytes of data held on everything from 1970s magnetic tapes through to hand-drawn charts and really old records that go back to the earliest days of seabed survey. I was on a call yesterday with people from the cable laying industry who advised me that they had literally, hand-drawn charts going right back to the days of laying those early telegraph cables. Right. And even that data, although it's very old, it's still useful to us because sometimes we will find that those manual soundings done quite, sometimes in the pre-sonar era, those earliest records really are rope going over the side of the ship to see how deep the seabed is, but it still gives us a physical measurement. And unfortunately, there is no satellite-based magic sensor yet that can penetrate the full ocean depth and tell you about the shape of the sea floor. You can make a good guesstimate using satellite altimetry, satellite radar systems, literally measuring changes in gravitational field caused by the presence of deep trenches or large mid-ocean mountains. But it's not fine resolution. You're certainly not going to come up with a chart that you could safely navigate with, which is why occasionally today you'll hear of a submarine occasionally hitting an uncharted seamount, which is literally not showing on any of the charts. So those physical measurements let us use those satellite-derived charts, the very low-resolution charts, and gives us actual data points that we can insert into the satellite data, and then that helps us ground truth them and get that fine resolution.
Okay, so that's interesting. You use the word accelerate and Seabed 2030 and accelerator. So in the same way that we saw huge leaps of science during the COVID pandemic when that hit us, and we saw vaccine acceleration, from what would have taken 10 years has now taken 6 months to 18 months. Yeah. Have you experienced any of these similar leaps for 2030? I mean, has it been a catalyst for leap change or step change?
I think it is, in conjunction with the other kind of mapping programs that are there, and I should give some credit to the UN Ocean Decade, this decade for ocean science for sustainable development. That with all of its family of programs, which includes Seabed 2030, together have been acting as a big catalyst for technology development, but particularly in marine autonomous systems. There will always only be a limited number of survey ships with a human crew on board. And even if we grabbed every last floating asset and said, please, can you go and map the seafloor for the rest of the decade, there just aren't enough hulls out there to be able to give us all the data we need. What the robots do is act as force multipliers. So you still need a mothership. You still need something that can top up their batteries and download the data and send it back to shore, except for the very longest range systems, which can indeed be launched from quayside. But what the robots let us do is go out, do the routine stuff, the mowing the lawn, the back and forth, just doing getting that high resolution map of the sea floor. Generally, surface autonomous vehicles. Rather than the subsurface one. The problem we still have with autonomous underwater vehicles is the amount of battery capacity you can fit onto those things. They're terrific for doing a short range survey, and they're very, very good for other oceanographic parameters. If you want to go away for 2 or 3 months underwater and all you're trying to do is measure temperature, salinity, and a few chemical parameters, you can do it. But if you're having to power a high energy echo sounder that's able to reach right down to full ocean depth and give you high resolution data back in return, you'll soon use up the batteries in most model of most of the survey AUVs tend to just go away for a few days, and then they get pulled up by the mothership, recharged, or the batteries changed, and in they go again. So what we are finding we're relying on a lot now are this new generation of autonomous surface vehicles, things like the Seabed device and the sail drone, explorers and things like that, which are able to go out there using relatively little energy to actually get from A to B, and therefore being able to use whether some of them are coated in solar panels, some of them have an onboard diesel generator. Either way, they have a level of energy on board which isn't matched by the autonomous underwater vehicles, and so we are able to carry long-range, deep penetration echo sounders to go out and help fill those gaps in the ocean.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. The sail drones. Speaking to those guys during the course of the year, solar panels on them, and of course, being bigger objects, you can fit more batteries in them anyway. So
that's right, and naturally, and the hydrogen fuel cells are coming on now. We recently signed a memorandum of understanding with a company called Aqua Ocean, who are developing a hydrogen fuel cell powered autonomous surface vehicle as well. And we're going to see a lot more of these technologies coming on stream over the next 5-10 years, which will largely be able to take over the kind of routine survey task, just getting soundings of the sea floor. And these things are really going to help us, get as close as possible to that 100% target.
Yeah. And that's a lot of organisations out there who are doing that. What benefits do they derive from Seabed 2030, besides, of course, being part of a project that's going to have a decades-long legacy?
Yeah, well, I think for many of them, that whole environmental, social, and governance aspect of the work matters to an increasing extent now. And by being seen to be part of that family of organizations contributing to the creation of the world's first high-resolution global ocean map, at the very least, it's a feel-good thing. It's been good citizens. It's been good corporate citizens. It's been good ocean citizens. So there's that kind of warm, fuzzy stuff, of doing something good. But on the more practical basis, it's the whole kind of collect once, use many times aspect. The number of times we speak to companies who are sending a ship out there to do a survey of an area that we know has previously been looked at by somebody else, but the whole thing has been kept commercially in confidence. Nobody shares the data, and then a whole bunch of money and resource and greenhouse gases gets wasted going out and remapping an area where the data already exists. So there is that practical money saving aspect too. We don't ask that everybody gives us their absolute highest resolution, sharpest data set. If somebody's having to measure the seafloor to millimeter accuracy because they're putting in some highly sophisticated piece of subsea engineering, we don't need that to go into the global ocean database. Right. We're happy to take something that's at a much lower level of resolution, so that it's enough to give us that detailed map of the global ocean floor, but it doesn't have to get right down to the level of where every individual rock is. We're quite happy to take something that's down to, in the case of the deepest waters, hundreds of meters resolution is fine.
Okay, so just thinking about that, that public service, the data that's gathered, that's creating this picture. Are parts of it available now, and will, for commercial use, do companies get charged, or will it be freely available?
Yeah, the whole purpose of the exercise is to have a freely available map. So we don't charge anybody for the data, and the condition that because we're not paying anybody for giving us the data, and part of the deal is we're not going to charge for anybody then to look at it.
And during those hydrographic surveys, have there been any wow moments? You've seen tectonic plates in positions you might not have seen them before or expected to see them, or have you found a new Mariana Trench, for example?
No, sadly not yet. As I keep saying, we've only got this quarter of the seabed measured at high resolution so far. So in that remaining 75%, who knows what surprises we're going to find down there, particularly in the very sparsely mapped regions, but parts of the South Pacific and the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean could well hold surprises for us. I think what we have been some of the first to discover. Your listeners and viewers will remember the massive Tonga volcano that happened fairly recently now, and of course when that thing blew, it completely transformed the shape of the seafloor. Just obliterated what had been there before, and by working with the partners that we have, we were able to send an autonomous survey vessel, one of the SeaKit vessels, into that region very shortly after the volcano, and get one of the first high-resolution seabed maps to show just how much that seafloor had changed after the eruption. So you could say things like that are part of our new discoveries that we're making. But so far, no new Marianas Trench.
That particular instance, when you were saying that from many years ago, there were drawings that people have mapped out and they were usable. As time moves on, then the sea floor will organically change, and that mapping, over the course of 100 years, perhaps, will change quite drastically as well as you get these shifts around. Yeah.
Exactly. In areas where you get things like these turbidity currents, these almost underwater avalanches, where material comes thundering down the continental slope, they can completely change the shape of the seabed in quite a short period of time. There's a famous story of, I think it was in the Grand Banks region off Newfoundland back in the last century. There was a particular underwater avalanche, and they could almost time it by the points where the telegraph cables failed, as they were being buried by these. By the current. And it was, again, a surprise to the researchers at the time, because people had assumed that the deep sea floor in particular was a rather placid place where not a lot goes on. But there are extreme events. And for example, as we see places like Greenland de-ice and parts of Antarctica de-ice, you get this isostatic rebound where the ground, the very bedrock itself starts to spring back up when it's been relieved of the weight of the overlying ice. And when that happens, it does destabilize slopes, and you will start seeing more underwater landslides, and that will change. Perhaps channels that were previously navigable find themselves infilled with debris in coastal waters around places like Greenland or other high latitude spots. So just because something has been mapped doesn't mean that it will stay exactly the same forever. And there are many instances around the world where things have to be resurveyed on quite a frequent basis to make sure that it's kept at kept at a decent level. But having said that, we've found there are still parts of the world, particularly in the South Pacific, where they're still using the prints of the hand-drawn maps by Captain Cook and La Perouse. So in some cases, that's still the highest resolution data. And that is a place where, as well as looking at the big companies, the food growers of this world, we also will look to even the recreational yachting community. Some of these people have reasonably deep pockets, and they build quite large ocean-going motor and sailing yachts, and sometimes they go to some of these obscure, remote little islands in distant parts of the ocean, and sometimes they might be the first vessel that's gone into one of these islands with a modern echo sounder on board. And again, we work with that community. We enable them to get access to data loggers, and they're able to do some private mapping for us, and again, as good citizens. And we call it crowdsourced bathymetry. And so even a private individual, albeit with fairly deep pockets, is able to go out there and gather data that gets fed again into the Seabed 2030 and JEBCO system. So there's an opportunity even for individuals. You don't have to be a big multinational survey organization to be able to contribute to the project.
Sure. So the Pendennises and the Wallies of this world are also getting involved in this by virtue of the fact they are building huge ships with great equipment and technology on them. That's really interesting.
Right. Yeah, no, they do help, and also the people who do the adventure tourism community. They're people who'll send small cruise liners into remote places. They again can sometimes be the only actors who've been in the region carrying modern navigational equipment, and the data that they gather is invaluable for feeding into the Seabed 2030 project.
Well, that's I hadn't thought of it like that, but of course you're right. There are many more other types of vessels out there who can do the job equally well, aren't they? Yeah. Great stuff. Okay, Steve. So I've got to thank you for your time today. I've certainly learned a lot. And where would people go to find out more? It's seabed2030.org. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah. seabed2030.org. And you could also look at Google JEBCO, GEBCO, General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans. That will also give you a lot of information. And but contact any of us at Seabed 2030, and we'll tell you what you'd like to know, and I'll probably try and persuade you to join us as a partner. There's no fee if somebody wants to join as a Seabed 2030 partner.
And Steve, cheekily, just before we drop off this call, Oceanology International, why do you attend? How do you benefit from OI?
Well, for me, Oceanology International is still one of the great one-stop shops in our community. It's one of the very few shows and conferences you can go to that will have a good representation of industry, of academics, of government-owned organizations, the people who actually make the sonars, the robots, the autonomous surface vehicles that all of us need to use to be able to understand what's going on in that 3/4 almost of the planet, which is covered with water. So it's a family. We all know each other quite well. It's not such a vast show that you haven't got a chance to get around to see everybody's stand and find out what people are doing. And there's usually there's always a good conference program associated alongside it, which gives us an opportunity to present our work, and we can discover firsthand what our colleagues out there in the community are doing as well.
Great stuff. Steve, once again, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully we can catch up again and do an interview a little bit later on in the season. In the meantime, Mr. Steve Hall, maritime explorer, scientist extraordinaire, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to chatting to you again in the future. Thank you very much, Steve. You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.